Hello, and in today's video, what I want to talk about is one of the things that's probably the most overlooked in pen turning, sanding. Yeah, I know, sitting through a 10-minute video on sanding is going to be a little tough. Most of us think all we do is we take our sandpaper, we plunge it up against the piece, we let the thing go as fast as we can, we go through these things, and we're done. But you know what? Sanding is really a skill, and it's something that we can work on and we can acquire. Have you ever taken a finished pen, one that you're really proud of, taken it upstairs, looked at it in the light and found little scratch marks on it? Now you got one of two options, right? The first option is I take that pen and I disassemble it and then I go through the entire refinishing process. Or the other one is I give it to my mother-in-law because it's got scratches in it. So, as I said, you don't want to get to the end of the pen and say, boy, if I would have just spent 5 more minutes on sanding, I would have been fine and this would have been a perfect pen. So one of the things that we're going to learn, as I said, is sanding is a skill, and we're going to learn to hone that skill. We're going to learn to be able to do it so we're actually not even thinking about it as we're doing it. So when does finishing start? If you've ever heard me talk before, finishing starts the minute I mount my pen. And so I'm going to take my time, I'm going to try to make clean cuts on my pen, I'm going to go through this, and I'm going to make sure that everything is done, because you have one of two options. You can spend 20 minutes sanding out your tool marks, or you can do your tool marks properly the first time, and we're going to take only a few minutes then to do sanding. So I've seen people, as I said, spend as much as a half hour sanding a pen. If you've done this right and you've got proper tool marks, you should be able to start with 200 grit sandpaper, and this is literally only going to take a few minutes. And as I said, the more we hone our skill, the better we're going to be at it. And what we're going to do is we're going to have it as second nature. So the first thing about sandpaper is it's called sandpaper. It's not called sculpting paper. We're not going to try to reform our design using sandpaper. We're not going to try to reform a curve. We're not going to try to knock something out. We're not going to try to knock a high point down. That's something we all learned if you've ever done flat work, that I'll always fix it when I go to sand. And you know what? That has never worked for me my entire life. So what we're going to do is we're going to sand, and we're going to do this as sandpaper. If we're going to do sculpting, you know what? I want you to sculpt with your tools. If you think that you want to change the shape on your pen as you're starting to sand, stop, go back, and do it with the tools. So there are a couple points of sandpaper that I want to talk about. There are two types of sandpaper, and we're going to use both of them. The first is paperback sandpaper, and I'll be honest with you, I picked this stuff up at Home Depot. I buy the big contractor sheets, and what I do is I cut them down into 1-inch by 3-inch squares. Then, as we go through it, this is also paperback, but this is wet dry. And I'll explain to you in a few minutes how we're going to use wet dry sandpaper. And the wet dry is the different sandpaper that we're going to do when we go through and we do wood and when we do acrylic. We're going to have two different techniques for how we're going to do sanding on the two different things. And then finally, it's our micro mesh. I love micro mesh, and what micro mesh affords me is that my ability that I'm going to be able to get up into the highest grits possible. And once again, much like we said in the other with the wet dry, when we get to the micro mesh, we're going to be doing it two different ways. So one of the most important things is once you pick your starting grit, go through all the grits. So if you start at 100 grit, I want you to use 150, I want you to use 180, I want you to use 220, and I want you to use 320 before you start to do the wet dry. You spent an hour turning this pen, picking out your kits, things like that, and now you want to start skipping grits. Or, worst case is, you want to go through and you're going to reuse the sandpaper too many times. This little piece of sandpaper, I've done the calculation on it, it cost me somewhere in the neighborhood of between 3 and 5 cents. So if we go through all 5 grits here, we're only looking at between 15 and 25 cents to improve your finishing 1,000 times over. So let's get to work. Let's talk about wood first. You know what? Let's talk about acrylic first, because we're going to be able to go through the whole entire sequence. So as I said, I'm going to start with whatever grit that I want to start with. Normally, in most cases, I'm going to start with 220, but you can start as low as 100 and we're fine with it. You're going to go through 100, 150, 180, 220, and 320, and you're going to hear me say that again in a little bit later point. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go through 400 grit, wet, dry, and we're going to do it wet. See, one of the interesting things about sanding acrylic is that you can actually see when you're done and how well you're finished. So you may not be able to see this blank perfectly because of everything that I have, but one thing I want you to notice is that I have a ton of lights when I'm going to get finished here. So I've got this spotlight, and you can see that it makes a big difference when I turn it on and off. And I've got yet another light above me that's sitting on a chain, and then I've got my ambient light that's sitting in the rest of the room. The more light that I can put on this process right now, the easier it's going to be for me to get that perfect finish, that consistent finish, and that no line and no scratch finish. So I'm going to just take one little quick piece of sandpaper. I'm going to take the 100 grit. I'm simply going to put my lathe. I like to do all my sanding at about 1,000. So if you looked at it when I was actually doing the turning on here, and you could see that when I was doing the sanding, you could actually see lines. And that's perfect. We actually want to see that. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get from starting at one end of the blank all the way to the other end of the blank a very consistent color. Normally it's somewhere around white or somewhere in that frame, but what we're looking to do is get consistent and get the scratch marks out of it that way. Most people then just turn the lathe on, go as fast as I can. I did my 100, now I'm going to go to my 220, now I'm going to go to my 320, I'm going to skip all the grits. It's not the best thing. So now I've got this blank on here, and I've turned it with the lathe on. I've got a whole bunch of what we call tangential scratches, right? The scratches are going in this way. The whole purpose of sandpaper is not to shape the pen, but just simply to remove the scratches that we had put in on the last one. So now I'll go to my next sandpaper, which in this case is 150, and I'll actually do it with the lathe off. And I'll go now with the grain. And I know you're saying acrylic doesn't have a grain, but it really does. So now you can see I've got that one. Then I'll take and I'll go to my 180, turn my lathe back on to about 1,000, push it there, I'm good. Now I'll take my sandpaper off. I'm going to go this way. I'm going to keep turning on my paper, and I'm going to go with the grain. So now on acrylic, I'm going to now use my wet dry, and I'm going to do it in wet mode. So I'm simply going to put it in a little bit of water, and you're going to see a dramatic difference now. And on the wet dry, I'm going to do it both ways. So I'm putting in a little bit of pressure. Got my lathe running right about right there's 1,000. Now I'm going to shut it off. I'm going to take my wet dry paper and I'm going to go with the grain. And hopefully you can see it's pretty much almost done. I'll run through my micro meshes, and then I'll do my polishing and my finish, and I'm going to call this one done. So in this case, I want you to notice one thing real close, is that this was practice, so I didn't have it anywhere near my bushings. One of the things I want you to do, and I want you to focus on, is that when you have your pen completely down to the bushings, and you've got it perfectly aligned, do not use any sandpaper above 220 anywhere near that corner. Don't use 100 and press into that corner, or 100 and press into this corner, because what's going to happen? You're going to undercut your bushings. That's the number one reason that people will undercut their bushings with acrylic, is because they get to the end and they're using a very aggressive sandpaper and they're cutting. It's no different than using the tools. Sandpaper is a cutting tool. And so what they do is they get near the end, they press in really hard, and what they do is then cut underneath the bushings. We do not want to do that. So nothing above, or in that case it would be below, 220 would ever be touched anywhere near my bushings. Once I get to 220 and 400, I can go near the bushings. I'll simply take my piece of sandpaper like this, I'll fold it over, and I'll turn and I'll make my quick cuts. Now, when we go to wood, wood's a little bit of a different animal. So what I want to do in wood is I'm going to use my traditional paperback. So I'm going to go through my 100, 150, 180, 220, 320, and then I'm going to use my wet dry, and I'm only going to do it in dry mode. And I'm going to finish it at that, or I'm going to stop at that point. Then I'm going to take it over and I'm going to actually apply my finish to this. With wood, I like to use a liquid finish. So it's a liquid finish in a bottle, and it's a finish that I'm really happy with. If I was to actually progress through the micro meshes at that point, and this is just personally, don't believe that I have enough to allow the finish to adhere to anything, because that finish would be way too smooth. So at 400, which to the naked eye you can get away with 400 you can still see, if I put it under a microscope, that I can still have a little bit of roughness, that I have something for this to grab onto. So I will then go through, I'll put my liquid finish on it, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back in, I'm going to start again with 400, and I'm going to hit it a couple times with the 400, and then I'm going to work my way up through all the micro meshes, buff it and sand it, and I'll have a perfect finish on it. And I've got other videos out there on that one, you can look it up. So, a couple things in terms of tips and techniques as we're coming up to closing on this video is, I once heard another professional turner say this, and it's something you've heard me say a million times. There's a myth out there with sandpaper. People believe somehow that if I use 200 grit sandpaper for a really, really, really long time, somehow miraculously it becomes 400 grit sandpaper. That's not the case. Sandpaper is actually made to fracture. So if I took a look at this piece of sandpaper and I did it under a microscope, you can see that there are teeth. Sandpaper is a cutting tool. And so as I use this sandpaper, it's going to go up, I'm going to get the teeth, and those teeth will eventually fracture, and they're going to dome over. When they dome over, if I keep using that piece of sandpaper too long, I'm no longer cutting, I'm burnishing. And if you've ever taken a look at a blank and you wonder, wow, why did I get 1 or 2 random scratches in it? It's because you used the sandpaper too long, the pieces around an area domed over, and then there was one little piece of sandpaper or the grit that didn't fracture, and it was a sharp point. I applied pressure on it, the ones that were domed over gave me, the dome over position on it, and the one that still was up, I actually used and I cut with it. And so that's pretty much the #1 cause of lines. One other thing that you can do, and if you've watched the way I did it, is when I'm doing my sanding on something, I will actually start out, and I'll actually start out with a little bit of pressure. And I'll rotate it around, and I've got that pressure on it. And then, as I rotate it around and rotate it around, my pressure is actually getting lighter. What am I doing? I'm already starting the blending process. I'm blending this blank so that when I go to the finer grit sandpaper, I've already got that and I don't have to worry about it. It's much more important as I'm doing it when I'm doing my micro meshes, but you can see even on here that as I was actually doing the sanding, my pressure is getting lighter and lighter and lighter. I'm turning it around and I'm ready, starting to blend it into the next piece. So, a couple things also. As I said, one of the most important parts of doing your finish in here is light. So you can see I've got 3 different lights and they're all buried on the piece that I've got it. That way I can see the finish on here. I can see the scratch on here. A couple other techniques is, don't be tempted to use that sandpaper for 1 more pen. Throw it out. As you hone your technique, it's going to come second nature. You're going to realize you can use sandpaper for 2 or 3 pens. But until you get your technique down and you're very happy and you're comfortable and you're getting a very consistent cut with your sandpaper, throw that piece out. So, for the most part, that covers everything I wanted to tell you about sanding. Covers everything that I wanted to tell you about preparing your pen for finish. We've talked a little bit about the differences in wood versus acrylic and how we're going to attack these differently. So hopefully these tips help. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. I sincerely try to look at them, and I will look at them and see if there's any questions or something that I can answer. Also, provide me with new topics. As we get into this series, I've got a whole bunch of new ideas for things that I want to do and different 10-minute videos that I want to put together. Put them on the bottom, and I promise you I'll take a look at it. So, thanks for viewing my video. If you like it, subscribe, give me a thumbs up. I appreciate it and hope to see you soon. Thanks. Bye. This video made possible by the fine folks at Exotic Blanks. For all your pen making needs, Exotic Blanks has you covered. Find them at www.exoticblanks.com. And also by Pen Makers International, the educational source for pen making.